Okay, welcome back. Eridu in former Sumer is established, and by 5000 BC, Athens, Telbrek, and Byblos have been settled in and becoming established. It's around 6000 BC that tribes in China near the Yangtze River start cultivating peaches. But they weren't peaches then, they were large berries that had a sweet sour taste, and they chose seeds from the best tasting ones, and over 5000 years later we have a large, sweet, juicy fruit. Near the end of the Mesolithic age, Uruk Sumer is established and the first temple is built. The Tajan culture is prominent in the Egyptian area, and they shortly established the area of Fayum. And right before God creates the universe in a week and creates Adam according to the Bible. And then a few years later, he creates Eve. China begins trading with nearby villages and cities, and by 4000 BC, they begin the first trails of the Silk Road by trading with Central Asia and to Europe regions. They trade their goods, including silk and rice and spices, mainly for horses that China didn't have a strong population of. They spread south to India soon after. The wheel and plow is invented in the Mediterranean region, and this changed farming techniques and lessened the time and energy it took to harvest and plant their fields of food. Cain and Abel are born according to the Bible at this time, and in North America, American tribes are moving large portions of earth and building mounds. In Egypt, the Badari culture is dominant, and the Nubian civilization, called Ta Seti, is also growing, and they're beginning to use copper. Now, the Copper Age only really spread throughout the Mediterranean regions and the African Horn. At this time, Egypt is divided by cultures, where the lower half of Egypt is the Red Land, and the upper is White Land. A king Menes unites Upper and Lower Egypt and establishes the city of Memphis. This is when, during the first dynasty, the Ta Seti are invaded and destroyed by the newly settled Egyptians in the Nile area. At the same time, Jerusalem is established in Israel. The Hatti culture is around now, and gold is starting to be used in this region. Now, at this time is when Adam dies in the Bible, and the Sumerians say that a giant man named Gilgamesh ruled Uruk for 126 years and then went on an epic journey later on. And Otzi the Iceman, a mummy that we found, lived at this time in Europe. Okay, now we have evidence that boats were in use in Australia at this time, and there are established settlements in China along the Yangtze River. Olmecs are settling themselves in Central America, and in Northern America, the Dorset tribes are spreading east across the continent. Now, over in Egypt, this is when the true ancient Egyptian culture begins with what we now call the Old Kingdom period, beginning with the first dynasty of King Menes and going well through the third dynasty. This is when the first pyramid, the step pyramid of Djoser, is built, and as they gain more power and people, the golden age of the Egyptians begins, and they start building the Great Pyramids around 3500 BC. And at the same time in the Mediterranean, the dynasty of Lagash is happening, and they build the first empire in the Anatolia region, which is modern-day Turkey, establishing Hattusa as the main city. In Uruk, the region of there are supposedly giants roaming around like Gilgamesh, and this is supposedly when Gilgamesh goes on his journey. According to the Bible, this is when Noah builds his boat and fills it with 2 of every species and floats around a water-covered earth until he lands his boat on the tip of Ararat Mountain. In Europe, a group of people build Stonehenge. Meanwhile, the Akkadians conquer Gilgamesh's city and all of Sumer, and the Assyrian culture flourishes around this time in this region as well. In Egypt, we have the 7th through the 12th dynasties, and this is referred to as the Middle Kingdom. Some civil wars break out at this time, and Egypt gets split up again into Upper and Lower, and now a Middle Egypt, which includes Thebes. The Middle Egypt establishes Heracleopolis as the main city and rule from there until Mentuhotep unites all of Egypt again a few hundred years later. In the Mediterranean region, we have groups of cultures becoming more prominent. These include the Minoans, the Hittites, and the Mycenaean people. These groups are the first to record writing as a language. They first use what is called Linear A, and then following that is Linear B. This is also when Sodom and Gomorrah's story happens in the Bible. Now, Hittites begin melting and casting iron, and this brings us into the Iron Age. Over in China, we have the Xia dynasty ruling most of the region, yet this dynasty does not utilize iron like the rest of the Western civilizations, and they remain in the Bronze Age for quite some time through the Shang dynasty and even as they build the first portions of the Great Wall. But they did begin trading with the Mediterranean and European regions, expanding the route. This Silk Road cuts down the travel time of 3 months down to just mere days. by using pit stops and trading horses at checkpoints meant that they didn't have to camp overnight and rest, but they could continue traveling with a baton passing style system. This cuts down the travel time by nearly 90% and rapidly changes the lifestyles of civilizations everywhere. Now in America, the native South Americans are using copper mainly to fuse blocks of rock together and as decorations for festivities or religious purposes. And the Olmecs down there are now farming maize, beans, chilies, peppers, and a lot more. Moses is born in the Bible, and the Exodus takes place at this time, including the creation of the Ark of the Covenant. Hittites in the Mediterranean region write the first law code, the Hammurabi Law, establishing the very first written rules of society. After that, the Minoan culture starts to fall, with a conflict between them and the Mycenaeans, and then a drought hits the area. This causes a famine in areas in Anatolia, Egypt, Cyprus Islands, and even the Sea of Galilee. This is when civilization in this region falls. A 300-year span of nearly no records in this time occurs. This region was dealing with water and food shortages and mainly migrated outward at this time. Following this dark age, south of the Mediterranean Sea in Egypt, the first female ruler, Queen Sobek-Neferu, takes the throne for the 13th dynasty, and the town of Itawi is established. Then Upper and Lower Egypt split once again, and a foreign leader takes the throne. They become referred to as the Hyksos, which is an Egyptian term for foreign leader. The Hyksos takes the throne and rules Lower Egypt, and the Thebans rule Upper during this 15th dynasty. Another civil war breaks out, and Hyksos is driven out, and I presume the land is united once again. Egypt still hasn't gotten on the bandwagon with iron and is still using bronze at this time, even though the Silk Road has now reached them. Now, all of this foreign leadership of the Hyksos sounds bad at first, but the Hyksos brought new technique for bronze work. They introduced horses and chariots, new bow and arrow weapons, and essentially paved the way for what will later be known as the New Kingdom. Now, once it all calms down a bit, the New Kingdom period begins. Hatshepsut takes the throne, and then Amenhotep III follows. Then Akhenaten, followed by Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut. Across the sea, the Mycenaeans collapse, and this is when we lose a lot of recorded history in this region. We're not exactly sure what happened there. But in North America, Native Americans are building even more earth mounds. The city of San Lorenzo is established, followed by La Venta in Central America, established by the Olmecs. Now, David and Goliath's battle happens in the Bible at this time, and this is when China begins building a wall. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the Hittites and Etruscans are prominent in gaining population numbers. And in Jerusalem, the same David that killed Goliath is now king, and he was handpicked by God and blessed by Israel's first king, Saul. And David then conquers Jerusalem and declares it the capital of the Jewish kingdom, formerly known as the tribe of Judah. David then unites all kingdoms of Israel after the death of the northern king. Then 40 years later, King David's son Solomon lays the foundation for the first holy temple. So in Greece, they slowly build cities and villages around this region, and although no one is really sure when or how Greece became official, by 776 they did hold the first official Olympic game. This is when, according to Roman myth, Romulus and Remus are born and given up to die floating down a river, and a wolf finds them and helps nurture and raise them. They then grow older, and the twins decide they want to rule a city, so Romulus kills Remus and establishes the city of Rome. Now, down in Egypt, the Hittites and Egyptians battle in the Battle of Kadesh under the rule of Ramesses II. After that, Ramesses III rules, and Egypt has another invasion by other local united groups, and they raid Egypt and steal a lot of wealth, and for a time, Egypt is ruled by foreign leaders again, like Libyans and Nubians, and is declared a part of the Kingdom of Kush. Then several hundred years later, the Assyrians absorb the Kush Empire and is now in control of the Egyptian lands and destroys the city of Memphis during this time. They also bring ironworking with them, and Egypt is now in their own Iron Age, which, as you can see, the Iron Age is divided into two phases because of this. This is also when China begins using iron, so they share the second phase of the Iron Age. Now, back in Egypt, the Sais culture then steals the throne and rules the region for a few hundred years until Persia overthrows them in the Battle of Pelusium. In Greece, in 490 BC, the Battle of Marathon happens, and this is when we get the miles for a marathon. Some guy ran that entire length in order to get to Sparta to ask them for help in battling the Persians. Sparta is a city-state in Greece, much like Athens. Both Sparta and Athens are the two biggest cities at this point in Greece. The Spartans wage a war against Athens, and Sparta wins, but it's very short-lived due to them invading the Thebans and then losing. And this is when we reach the golden age for Greece. And it lasts about 200 years, and this is when a lot of construction of temples, arenas, monuments, and a lot of the philosophy comes from. Socrates didn't actually write anything down, but he did open up a school called the Academy. And so Socrates had a student named Plato who wrote all about Socrates. Then Plato opened his own academy, and he had a student named Aristotle who ended up mentoring Alexander the Great. Now, Rome has supposedly been ruled by 7 consecutive kings after Romulus until the locals overthrow the last king and declare the state to be a republic. Then Hannibal of the Gaul region attacks Rome at this time, and lots of conflicts arise. And in South America, the Mayan culture is spreading and begins flourishing in this region. They build temples and pyramids, establishing a city called Tikal. Many other cultures begin to flourish in this area, including the Toltecs. Soon after, in Egypt, Ptolemy takes the throne, and the successive rulers after him all take the name of Ptolemy, defining this era as Ptolemaic Egypt. In Greece, Alexander the Great is born and soon becomes instrumental in the changes to come in this region. He gains power and then defeats the Persian army, becoming an ally to Egypt. He then builds the city of Alexandria in Egypt and creates the biggest known library of its time. He collects documents, records, papers, and stories from all over the world. Greece's power declines at this point, and in this weakened state, Rome usurps Greece and becomes one big empire. They then take this power and usurp all of Etruria as well. At the same time, the Native Americans begin their own trading system similar to the Silk Road and trade goods between native nations, now known as a Hopewell trading system. In China, Emperor Qin takes the throne, and this begins the period of time that is known as Imperial China. Now, back in Rome, Spartacus leads a revolution against the rulers, and chaos develops. Julius Caesar is born, and he becomes emperor and becomes a crazed militant who simply cannot stop killing his perceived enemies. He also hates that he is going bald, so he starts wearing a crown of leaves around his head so no one will notice. He also, under no instigation whatsoever, decides that Rome should be even bigger and goes to Gaul and spends wealth, time, and the lives of his men decimating the population of Gaul, just to be able to come back to Rome and say that he killed a bunch of people in the name of Rome. So on his way back, after leaving Rome and spending almost all of its wealth and leaving the citizens practically starving against the wishes of the Senate. So this is where the term crossing the Rubicon comes from, because this is the river that divided Gaul from Rome. Because crossing the border into Rome meant that he would be held responsible for his actions, but he crosses into Roman Italy anyway, and although he is unwanted, his army that he comes back with, who has been with him the entire time, aids in his security, and with this power, he actually takes Rome through a civil war he creates upon returning. During these Civil War battles, he besieges Alexandria, and being flanked by Egyptian fleets at the harbor, he accidentally burns down the amazing library full of irreplaceable documents and records, the Library of Alexandria. So he then seizes control and goes ahead and changes a lot of stuff, like our calendar. He literally names a month after himself, July. And in Egypt, Cleopatra is born at this time, and she takes the throne along with her 12-year-old brother, and she meets Julius Caesar. They actually have a kid together and are like this weird power couple, and then gives citizenship to a lot of people on the outskirts of this region and soon gains popularity with the people. The Senate is not happy about this at all. Although they have lost all power to him, they're still around and are still all very elitist. So Julius then declares himself the dictator for life, that is. So on the 15th of March, dubbed the Ides of March, by his psychic and a warning delivered to Caesar, he still goes ahead with his planned meeting, and the Senate actually assassinates him that day. So with Julius assassinated, Cleopatra goes back to Egypt, taking their son Caesarion with her, and Augustus, the adopted son of Caesar, takes the throne. Augustus, Lepidus, and Mark Antony try to get revenge on the Senate assassins and take control. They divide the region up, and Augustus gets Rome, Mark Antony gets Egypt. Cleopatra and Mark Antony now fall in love, and then Augustus gets mad about this and feels threatened and decides Cleopatra and Mark Antony need to be taken from power, so Augustus sends the Roman army to get them. They clash at Actium, Greece, and so they both flee back to Egypt, with the Roman army following close behind. As the army closes in, the two lovers decide to commit suicide rather than be imprisoned by the Romans. This makes way for Augustus to seize Egypt, and he now rules Roman Egypt. And a little while later, Jesus is born to a virgin mother in a horse stable and quickly becomes the face of humanity and preaches of being kind and caring. So the Romans kill him publicly, denouncing this idea. And this is when we hit the end of the BCs and move into AD. So I'm going to stop the video here and we'll just start fresh at the ADs for the next video. Okay, thanks. Stay tuned.